He was one of the sharpest minds to ever step into a wrestling ring, a master of promos who could control a crowd with just his voice, his eyes, and that infamous snake. Jake. The Snake Roberts created one of the most feared finishing moves in wrestling and became a legend without ever holding a major championship, which says a lot about how powerful he really was. But when you look deeper into his life, from a brutal childhood in Texas to the dark struggles that followed him for years, you start to see a different story. This is not just about a wrestler who fell short, it is about a man who was failed again and again by the people and the industry around him. And to understand how it all went wrong, you have to start with the pain he carried long before he ever stepped into the ring. Aurelian Smith Jr. was born on May 30th, 1955, in Gainesville, Texas. And right from the beginning, his story was steeped in violence and tragedy. His father was a professional wrestler named Aurelian Grizzly Smith, a massive man, 6'10", 350 pounds, a legitimate tough guy by all accounts. And also by all accounts, one of the most monstrous human beings to ever walk the earth. Jake's very existence was the product of unspeakable cruelty. Grizzly Smith had been dating Jake's grandmother, and one night, when the grandmother was unavailable, Grizzly went into another room and sexually assaulted her daughter, Jake's mother. She was somewhere between 12 and 14 years old at the time, depending on which account you follow. A child. And because this was rural Texas in the 1950s, because records were sparse and nobody was going to hold a big intimidating wrestler accountable for anything, the two were forced into a marriage to avoid scandal. Jake's mother had 3 children before she turned 17. She was divorced shortly after. Think about that for a second. Before Jake Roberts even drew his first breath, his life was shaped by sexual violence, coercion, and the absolute failure of every adult and institution around him to protect the vulnerable. That pattern would repeat itself for the next 6 decades. After his parents split, Jake went to live with his maternal grandmother. And for a brief period, things were okay. His grandmother loved him. She cared for him. She was the one stable presence in a world that had been chaotic since before he was born. And then she died of cancer. Just like that. The one person who had shown Jake unconditional love was gone. His stepfather, another man Jake had grown to love and trust, was electrocuted in a work accident and died. Another anchor ripped away. Another lesson that the world would take everything good from you the moment you started to depend on it. And then Jake was sent to live with his father and his father's new wife, and that is where the real nightmare began. Grizzly Smith's new wife was barely 5 or 6 years older than Jake himself. She was practically a child raising children. And she was abusive in ways that no child should ever have to endure. Jake has spoken publicly about the sexual abuse he suffered at her hands. Physical abuse, too. When Jake finally worked up the courage to tell his father what was happening, his stepmother's response was to beat him with wire hangers, relentlessly, viciously. And Grizzly Smith did nothing. Because Grizzly Smith didn't care. Multiple members of the family have gone on record saying they believe the entire arrangement was Grizzly's doing in the first place. But Grizzly's depravity didn't stop with his wife's actions. He was doing the same things, and worse, to his own daughters. Jake's sister was sexually assaulted by their father repeatedly. She was pregnant 3 times before she turned 18. Nobody intervened. Nobody helped. Nobody even acknowledged what was happening, because Grizzly Smith was a big man in the wrestling business. And in that world, in that era, nobody asked questions about what happened behind closed doors. And there was one more cruelty. One that seems almost absurdly petty compared to everything else, but that tells you everything about the kind of man Grizzly Smith was. He never told his children that wrestling was scripted. He would come home wearing neck braces and bandages from storyline injuries. He would limp around the house selling a worked knee. And his children, Jake included, grew up genuinely believing that their father was fighting for his life every single night. That every match could be his last. That the violence they saw on television was real, and that the man who was supposed to protect them might not come home one day. Imagine being a child. Already traumatized. Already abused. Already grieving the loss of every person who ever showed you kindness. And on top of all of that, living in constant terror that your father is going to be killed in the ring. That was Jake Roberts' childhood. Every single day. His sister eventually escaped Grizzly's abuse the only way she knew how. She ran away with a man who was 55 years old when she was just 18. Out of the frying pan and into the fire. Within a year, she had a child with this older man. And then his ex-wife showed up, kidnapped Jake's sister, and murdered her. They never found the body. The ex-wife only got 10 years on a kidnapping charge because without a corpse, the courts couldn't prove the killing. Jake's brother Sam Houston became a wrestler too. He had a decent run in the WWE in the mid-1980s but spiraled into alcoholism and repeated DUI arrests. Grizzly Smith apparently used his connections in the business to keep Sam out of prison for years, pulling favors and making problems disappear, until 2005 when the courts finally sentenced Sam to prison for his continued offenses. His sister Robin, who wrestled as Rockin' Robin and even held the WWE Women's Championship for 2 years, battled her own demons with substance abuse. Every single one of Grizzly Smith's children was damaged. Every single one of them carried scars that would last a lifetime. The one sibling who seemed to avoid the worst of it was Richard, who was put up for adoption at an early age and never entered the wrestling business. Make of that what you will. And the wrestling business was waiting for the rest of them with open arms. Because the wrestling business loves broken people. It loves people who will sacrifice everything, endure anything, work through any amount of pain. Because they've been conditioned since childhood to believe that suffering is just what life is. The industry doesn't create the trauma, but it feeds on it. It rewards it. It promotes the people who can channel their darkness into compelling television and then act surprised when that darkness spills over into their real lives. Jake Roberts walked into professional wrestling in 1974. He was 19 years old. He had no other skills, no education to speak of, no support system, no therapy, no understanding of what had been done to him or why he felt the way he felt. He just knew that wrestling was the family business, and it was the only door that was open to him. And here is where the wrestling industry enters the story not as a savior, but as the next in a long line of abusers. Jake spent his early years working the territories, Louisiana, Mid-South, Georgia, the Carolinas. He was good. Everyone who saw him knew he was good. But he struggled to develop a character because, in his own words, he didn't know who he was. How could he? He'd never been allowed to be anyone. He'd been too busy surviving. It was during these years that Jake discovered what would become both his greatest professional asset and his most devastating personal weapon. He learned that the darkness inside him, the trauma, the paranoia, the inability to trust anyone, the constant state of hypervigilance that comes from growing up in an abusive household, all of it could be channeled into a wrestling character. He could take the worst parts of his life and turn them into money. Jake himself put it best. He said his wrestling character was not an act. He said one of the reasons he was so good at doing interviews and coming up with storylines was because he learned to lie quickly. After you are sexually abused, he said, you learn to lie quickly and constantly be on guard. As Jake the Snake, he never wanted you to trust him. If you could trust him, then that meant the relationship was getting good. And Jake knew what happened when relationships got good. People hurt you. That is a staggering admission. The entire Jake the Snake character, the character that captivated millions of people, the character that changed what it meant to be a villain in professional wrestling, was built on the psychological architecture of childhood sexual abuse. And the wrestling industry didn't just accept that. It celebrated it. It profited from it. It put it on television every single week and sold advertising against it. And it never once stopped to ask whether the man behind the character might need help. In 1986, Jake Roberts arrived in the World Wrestling Federation. He debuted at the Boston Garden on March 8th, defeating Jose Luis Rivera. A month later, he made his pay-per-view debut at WrestleMania 2, defeating George Wells. And during that match, Jake did something that had never been done before. After putting Wells away with the DDT, he took his Python Damien out of the bag and wrapped the snake around his unconscious opponent. Wells foamed at the mouth. The crowd went insane, and just like that, professional wrestling had a new kind of villain. Almost immediately, Jake became one of the most compelling performers in the company. His promos were unlike anything wrestling had ever seen. Dark, psychological, layered with menace and intelligence. While everyone else was screaming about eating vitamins and saying their prayers, Jake was whispering about trust and betrayal and the things that lurk in the shadows. He was operating on a completely different level. There is a famous story from late 1986 that tells you everything about how good Jake was and how the industry responded to it. The WWE gave Jake his own talk show segment called The Snake Pit, modeled after Roddy Piper's pit. During one taping, Jake invited the biggest star in the company, Hulk Hogan himself, onto the show, and then he DDT'd Hogan on the floor. The segment was supposed to launch a massive feud between the two. But when they started running the matches on the house show circuit, the fans were cheering for Jake over Hogan. The crowd was choosing the traumatized, psychologically complex anti-hero over the all-American Say Your Prayers babyface. And rather than recognizing that they had something special, rather than adapting to what the audience was telling them, the WWE scrapped the entire angle. The segment only aired regionally and has never been seen since. Jake was turned babyface shortly afterward. This pattern would define Jake's career in the WWE. He was always too good for his own good, too compelling, too real. He made the carefully constructed heroes of the wrestling world look shallow by comparison, and the industry didn't know what to do with someone like that except keep him in a holding pattern, always near the top but never quite at it. Always the guy who made other people's feuds better. Never the guy who got to hold the prize himself. His matches weren't technical masterpieces. Jake was never the most athletic guy in the ring, but he understood psychology better than anyone. He understood how to make you feel something, how to build tension, how to make 20,000 people hold their breath, how to make a moment matter. He had feuds with Rick Rude, who tried to kiss Jake's real-life wife Cheryl at ringside, turning a sleazy gimmick into a deeply personal angle that had real emotional stakes. He feuded with Andre the Giant, exploiting the Giant's genuine fear of snakes in a way that was both brilliant television and a perfect example of Jake's ability to find a psychological weakness and twist it until it broke. During that feud, Andre was battling serious health problems behind the scenes, and Jake was tasked with carrying matches in which the biggest star in the building could barely move. He did it without complaint. He made Andre look as good as anyone could have, because that was what Jake did. He made everyone around him better, even at his own expense. And then there was the DDT, a move he invented by accident during his time in the territories when an opponent tripped him during a front facelock and fell on his head, legitimately knocking himself out. Jake saw the potential immediately. He refined it. He perfected it. And it became arguably the most protected, most devastating finishing move of the 1980s. The WWE would later name it the coolest maneuver of all time. The snake gimmick only amplified everything. Damien, his python, became one of the most recognizable props in wrestling history. The combination of Jake's sinister charisma and the primal fear of a massive serpent created something that transcended wrestling. Kids were terrified. Adults were mesmerized. Andre the Giant, the eighth wonder of the world, was apparently genuinely afraid of snakes, and Jake exploited that fear brilliantly in their feud. But here is where the exploitation begins. Because despite being one of the most over, most talked about, most merchandise-moving performers in the company, Jake Roberts never got a run with a major championship. Not even the Intercontinental title, which was practically designed for upper mid-card guys who could carry a feud. The plan at one point was for Jake to win the Intercontinental Championship from the Honky Tonk Man. It was going to lead to a huge program with the $1 Million Man. It was going to be the culmination of everything Jake had been building toward. And then the Honky Tonk Man hit Jake with an ungimmicked guitar on the Snake Pit interview segment. A guitar that was not prepared to break easily. The impact legitimately injured Jake's neck and back. The Honky Tonk Man has denied doing it on purpose, but Jimmy Hart, who was managing Honky at the time, and video evidence from the incident suggest otherwise. Jake later said he was picking pieces of wood out of his back for weeks. That injury changed everything. The title plans were scrapped. Jake never got his championship moment. And because the show must go on, because in the wrestling business of the 1980s there was no injured reserve, no workers' compensation, no time off to heal properly, Jake kept working. Night after night. City after city. 300 shows a year. Close to 300 nights on the road, away from any semblance of a normal life, driving from town to town in rental cars, checking into hotels at 2 in the morning, performing the next night, and doing it all over again. That was the schedule. That was what the WWE demanded of its performers. And if you couldn't handle it, there were 10 guys behind you who would happily take your spot. Vince McMahon himself once made an observation about Jake that revealed more than he probably intended. McMahon said he didn't know if you could separate Jake Roberts the performer from Jake Roberts the person. He said he never knew which one he was talking to, and he didn't know that they weren't the same. That quote is telling because McMahon, the man who controlled Jake's career, who decided how much he got paid and what storylines he was given and whether he got a championship run, was freely admitting that he could see the line between performance and reality was blurred for Jake. He could see that Jake was not playing a character so much as he was hemorrhaging on camera. And knowing that, he kept booking him, kept profiting from it, kept the machine running. And to get through those shows, to manage the constant searing pain in his neck and back, Jake started taking painkillers. Lots of them. Muscle relaxers to sleep, uppers to wake up, downers to function. A cocktail of pharmaceuticals that would have put a normal person in the hospital. And the wrestling business didn't just enable this, it facilitated it. Jake has spoken publicly about the drug culture in the WWE during the 1980s. He described a doctor who would meet the wrestlers at events, carrying 6 or 7 suitcases full of pills and steroids. You could walk in and ask for Valium, Halcyon, painkillers, steroids, whatever you wanted. No prescription needed, no questions asked, no follow-up. Just take the pills and go perform. And then figure out what combination of chemicals would get you from one day to the next without falling apart. This wasn't Jake Roberts being weak. This was an entire industry built on the exploitation of human bodies without any safety net whatsoever. No health insurance, no union, no drug testing for most of the era, no mental health support, nothing. You worked until you couldn't work anymore, and then they replaced you with someone younger and hungrier. And if you developed a drug problem along the way, well, that was your problem, not the company's. In 1991 and 1992, Jake had one of the most compelling character arcs in wrestling history when he turned heel against Randy Savage. The storyline was dark, even by today's standards. Jake crashed the wedding reception of Savage and Miss Elizabeth. He tormented Savage with mind games. He had a cobra bite Savage on the arm during a live broadcast. The feud was brilliant television, and it was fueled entirely by the genuine darkness inside Jake Roberts. The same darkness that came from being abused. The same darkness that the wrestling industry was perfectly happy to monetize without ever addressing its source. By 1992, Jake's relationship with the WWE was deteriorating. His substance abuse was becoming harder to hide. His behavior was becoming erratic. And rather than helping him, rather than offering treatment or support, the company let him go. Jake Roberts was no longer useful to them, so they moved on. What happened next was perhaps the cruelest chapter in a career full of cruel chapters. Jake signed what was supposed to be a lucrative multi-million-dollar contract with WCW under executive Kip Frye. This was going to be his fresh start, his chance to rebuild. But Vince McMahon had one last card to play. As part of Jake's exit from the WWE, McMahon enforced a 90-day non-compete clause. Jake figured fine, 90 days off wouldn't be bad. He could use the rest. But during those 90 days, Kip Frye was fired from WCW. His replacement was Bill Watts, a man Jake had genuine heat with from his days in Mid-South Wrestling. And Watts, knowing full well that Jake had no other options, tore up the original contract and offered him a fraction of the deal. Jake estimates he went from making about $3.5 million a year to roughly $200,000. And Watts stripped him of his snake gimmick on top of it. No snake, no entrance, no identity. Just a broken man working for a fraction of what he was worth because the people in power knew they had him over a barrel. Jake has been open about the fact that this is what pushed him into cocaine. He had always been able to handle whatever he put in his body before. Alcohol, pills. He would come out the other side. But cocaine was different. Cocaine tore him apart. And the thing that drove him to cocaine was not personal weakness. It was the systematic exploitation and betrayal by an industry that treated its performers like disposable commodities. By the mid to late 1990s, Jake Roberts was a cautionary tale walking around on two legs. He was working independent shows for almost nothing, sleeping in his car, smoking crack in hotel rooms, estranged from his daughter and his other 7 children. A man who had once performed in front of 80,000 people at WrestleMania was now wrestling in high school gymnasiums for promoters who didn't care whether he lived or died as long as he showed up. The 1999 documentary Beyond the Mat captured Jake at what was arguably his lowest point. The filmmaker Barry Blaustein followed Jake as he attempted to reconnect with his estranged daughter Brandy, and then filmed him shortly after reportedly smoking crack in a hotel room. The film showed a man in the grip of addiction, rambling about his sexual exploits on the road, unable to function as a parent or a human being. And here is where the exploitation gets layered on top of itself. Jake has maintained for decades that he was told the documentary would be used to help children see the darker side of wrestling, that it was supposed to be an educational tool. Instead, it was released theatrically and became a cult classic among wrestling fans. Jake says he never received a dime from it. He later said the film did nothing but harm him and his family. Blaustein has disputed this account. He says he never told Jake the film was intended for kids. He questions Jake's grasp of reality. And maybe there is a version of events where both men believe they are telling the truth, but the end result is undeniable. A man in the depths of addiction and mental illness was filmed at his absolute worst. That footage was packaged and sold for profit, and the subject received no compensation and no help. Whether you call that documentary filmmaking or exploitation probably depends on which side of the camera you were standing on. And then there was Heroes of Wrestling, October 1999. A pay-per-view event at the Casino Magic Hotel in Bay St. Louis, Mississippi. A nostalgia show, bringing back the stars of the 1980s for one more night. Jake was booked in the main event against Jim Neidhart. When the camera cut to Jake for his pre-match promo, it was immediately obvious that he was in no condition to perform. His eyes were glazed, his speech was slurred, he could barely stand. He gave a rambling, incoherent promo about playing cards and spinning wheels that made absolutely no sense. The interviewer looked visibly uncomfortable. Anyone watching could see that this man needed medical attention, not a wrestling match, and the production truck made the decision to keep rolling. They broadcast a man in the middle of a substance abuse crisis to a paying audience. They let him walk to the ring. They let him take out his snake and make obscene gestures with it. They let him stumble around the ring unable to execute basic wrestling moves. They let the whole thing play out on live pay-per-view because they had already collected the money and the show had to go on. Jim Neidhart, to his credit, tried to carry Jake through something resembling a match. Eventually, Yokozuna and King Kong Bundy had to be sent to the ring early to salvage the situation. The show was a disaster. It drew roughly 29,000 pay-per-view buys. Plans for a sequel were immediately scrapped. But the real damage wasn't financial. The real damage was that once again, the wrestling industry had put Jake Roberts in a position to destroy himself on camera. And once again, not a single person in a position of authority had the decency to say stop. To say this man needs help, not a spotlight. To say we have a responsibility to protect someone who clearly cannot protect himself right now. The wrestling community condemned the event after the fact. It was called a disgrace and a dangerous exploitation of talent. But the condemnation always came after. Always after the money had been collected. Always after the footage had been broadcast. Always after the damage had been done. That was the pattern of Jake Roberts' entire life. The abuse came first, the acknowledgement came later. The help came never. Or almost never. Because in 2012, something happened that nobody expected. Something that broke the pattern. Something that, against all odds and all precedent, actually saved Jake Roberts' life. Diamond Dallas Page, a man Jake had helped train and mentor during the early years of DDP's career, reached out to Jake and invited him to come live at his home in Atlanta. By this point, Jake was in catastrophic shape. He weighed over 300 pounds. He could barely walk without becoming short of breath. He was drinking and using again. He was financially destitute. He was, by any reasonable medical assessment, dying. And DDP said, "Come stay with me. We are going to fix this." What most people forget about the years between Jake's WCW run and his eventual rehabilitation is just how many times the industry circled back to him, not to help him, but to extract one more payday from whatever was left. In 1996, Jake returned to the WWE as a born-again Christian character. The religious persona was partly genuine. Jake was searching for anything that could fill the void inside him. And the WWE used that sincerity as a storyline prop. They had him quote scripture in his promos. They had him Bible thump his way through feuds. And then they had Stone Cold Steve Austin cut the promo that launched a career, the famous Austin 3:16 speech, by having Austin mock Jake's faith on live television after beating him in the King of the Ring tournament. That moment was the birth of the Austin era. It changed wrestling forever. And the platform for that transformation was a broken man's genuine attempt to find spiritual meaning in his life being turned into a punchline for someone else's catchphrase. Jake was the stepping stone. Again. Used and discarded. Again. After that second WWE run fizzled out, Jake drifted through ECW, independent shows and sporadic appearances in various promotions. Each one booking him because his name still meant something, each one fully aware of his condition, each one choosing to look the other way because a recognizable name on the poster meant a few more tickets sold. The years between 1997 and 2012 were a blur of small venues, bad decisions, and a body slowly giving out under the weight of decades of substance abuse. Jake was homeless at various points. He was sleeping in his car. He was performing for $50 a night in front of crowds of 100 people. A man who had once stood across the ring from Hulk Hogan, who had DDT'd opponents in front of millions on national television, was now working high school cafeterias and VFW halls because the wrestling industry had no retirement plan, no pension fund, no safety net of any kind. The rehabilitation was documented in the 2015 film, The Resurrection of Jake the Snake. And unlike Beyond the Mat, this documentary was made with Jake's full participation and consent. It showed him struggling, sweating through DDP yoga sessions, battling cravings, dealing with the physical and emotional wreckage of 40 years of abuse, addiction, and neglect. But it also showed him winning, slowly, painfully, one day at a time. During the filming, Jake needed shoulder surgery. He couldn't afford it. The money was raised through crowdfunding. Think about that. A man who had made millions of dollars for Vince McMahon, who had sold out arenas around the world, who had helped create some of the most memorable moments in wrestling history, could not afford a surgery he desperately needed. The fans had to pay for it. Because the industry that profited from his talent had no mechanism, no interest, and no obligation to take care of him when he couldn't take care of himself. After 18 months with DDP, Jake had lost over 50 pounds. He had regained mobility. He was sober for the first time in his adult life. He was, against all probability, alive and getting better. In February 2014, TMZ reported that Jake had been diagnosed with muscular cancer below his knee and was scheduled for surgery. His response was pure Jake Roberts. He said if the devil couldn't defeat him, cancer didn't stand a chance. He told people to pray for sick children instead, because the snake would be just fine. And he was fine. He beat the cancer, just as he had beaten the addiction. Just as he had survived the abuse, the exploitation, the betrayal, the grief, the abandonment, and every other thing that life and the wrestling business had thrown at him. On April 5th, 2014, Jake the Snake Roberts was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame. Standing on that stage, sober, healthy, surrounded by the peers who had watched him nearly destroy himself for 3 decades, Jake delivered an acceptance speech that was classic Roberts. Funny, dark, self-aware, brutally honest. The same skills that had made him a generational talent in the ring were now being used to tell the truth about his life. Not the kayfabe version, the real version. He was inducted into the Professional Wrestling Hall of Fame in 2020. He signed contracts with both WWE as a Legends Ambassador and with AEW, where he served as a manager for Lance Archer and later as a special advisor for the company's community outreach program, AEW Together. And here's where some people might want to end the story. The redemption arc, the comeback, the feel-good ending that wrestling fans love because it mirrors the structure of a babyface turn. The hero falls, suffers, and ultimately rises again. Credits roll. Everyone goes home happy. But that ending, as satisfying as it is, obscures something important. It obscures the fact that Jake Roberts should never have needed redemption in the first place. Not from this, not from any of this. Because if you trace the timeline of Jake's life with clear eyes and an honest heart, what you see is not a man who made bad choices and paid the price. What you see is a man who was victimized at every single stage of his existence, victimized by a predatory father who should have been in prison, victimized by an abusive stepmother who should have been stopped, victimized by a wrestling industry that treated him as a commodity rather than a human being, victimized by promoters who stripped him of his livelihood and dared him to complain, victimized by a culture that provided unlimited access to drugs and absolutely no access to treatment, victimized by a pay-per-view company that broadcast his breakdown for profit, victimized by a documentary filmmaker who turned his worst moments into entertainment. At every point where someone could have helped Jake Roberts, they chose to exploit him instead. At every point where someone could have said enough, they chose to keep the cameras rolling. At every point where the wrestling industry could have shown even a basic duty of care toward one of its most talented and troubled performers, it chose profit over people. And Jake was not alone in this. That is the part that makes his story not just tragic but systemic. The wrestling industry of the 1980s and 1990s destroyed hundreds of people. The death toll from that era is staggering. Wrestlers dying in their 30s and 40s from heart attacks, overdoses, suicides. Men who gave everything to the business and got nothing back except broken bodies and empty bank accounts. Jake Roberts survived. Many of his contemporaries did not. The Heroes of Wrestling event, where Jake had his infamous breakdown, also featured Jim Neidhart, Yokozuna, and King Kong Bundy. Jake outlived all three of them. He outlived 5 others from that night's card as well. He outlived so many of the men he worked with during the Golden Era that his continued existence feels like an act of defiance against a business that was trying to kill him. And maybe that is the real legacy of Jake the Snake Roberts. Not the DDT, not Damien, not the promos that still give people chills decades later. Not even the redemption story, as powerful as it is. The real legacy is the indictment. The living, breathing proof that the wrestling industry as it existed during its most profitable era was fundamentally, structurally, and morally broken. Jake Roberts walked into professional wrestling as a traumatized child looking for the only escape route available to him. The industry took everything he had: his health, his family, his sobriety, his dignity, his money, his identity. It took the worst parts of his childhood trauma and turned them into a television character. It fed him pills when he was in pain and fired him when the pills became a problem. It paid him millions when he was useful and discarded him when he wasn't. It filmed him at his lowest and sold the footage to the highest bidder. It booked him to perform when he couldn't stand up and then blamed him for the result. And through all of it, through every betrayal and every exploitation and every indignity, Jake Roberts kept going. He kept working. He kept showing up. Because wrestling was all he had. It was the only thing he'd ever known. It was the family business, passed down from a father who was a monster, in an industry that was built to consume the vulnerable and spit them out when there was nothing left. The fact that Jake Roberts is alive today is not a testament to the wrestling industry's capacity for redemption. It is a testament to one man's refusal to die. It is a testament to Diamond Dallas Page's willingness to do what the entire wrestling industry refused to do for decades, which was simply to care about another human being. And it is an indictment of every single person, promoter, executive, and corporation that watched Jake Roberts fall apart in real time and chose to do nothing. They don't make them like Jake Roberts anymore. And maybe that's for the best. Maybe the world doesn't need any more men whose childhood trauma is so perfectly calibrated for professional wrestling that the industry can't resist the temptation to exploit it. Maybe the wrestling business is better now. Maybe the wellness policies and the healthcare programs and the mental health resources that exist today are proof that the industry learned something from watching men like Jake Roberts nearly die. But Jake paid for those lessons. He paid with decades of his life, with his health, with his relationships with his 8 children, with his sanity, with everything he had. And here is the thing that haunts you when you really sit with Jake Roberts' story. The thing that keeps you up at night if you let it. For every Jake Roberts who survived, for every man who somehow clawed his way back from the abyss, there are dozens who didn't. The Louis Spicali's, the Brian Pillmans, the Eddie Guerreros. The list of wrestlers from that era who died young is so long that you could fill a cemetery with it. Men who had the same addictions, the same untreated injuries, the same access to pills and powders and no access to help. Men whose bodies and minds were consumed by the same industry that consumed Jake's. The only difference is that they never got a Diamond Dallas Page knocking on their door. They never got a documentary about their resurrection. They just died. Quietly, in hotel rooms and apartments. And the industry mourned them for exactly as long as it took to sell a memorial t-shirt, and then moved on to the next broken body willing to take their place. The wrestling industry owes Jake the Snake Roberts a debt it can never repay. Not with a Hall of Fame ring. Not with a Legends contract. Not with a standing ovation at a ceremony. The debt is simpler than that and far more damning. The wrestling industry owed Jake Roberts basic human decency, and for 30 years, it refused to pay. Jake once said something that cuts to the heart of everything. He said he was afraid to hold his own daughters in his lap because he was terrified that whatever demon lived inside his father might somehow manifest in him. A man so damaged by what was done to him as a child that he couldn't allow himself to love his own children for fear of hurting them. A man who kept the entire world at arm's length because every time he had ever let someone close, they had either abused him, abandoned him, or died. And the wrestling industry looked at that man, at that pain, at that bottomless well of trauma, and it said, "This is perfect. We can use this." That is the story of Jake the Snake Roberts, not the victim of his own choices, the victim of professional wrestling, the victim of a system that was designed from the ground up to consume people exactly like him. And the fact that he survived it, the fact that he's still here, still talking, still telling his story with the same dark brilliance that made him famous, is not the happy ending the wrestling industry deserves. It's the happy ending Jake Roberts earned, in spite of everything and everyone who tried to take it from him. Like and subscribe for more hard-hitting wrestling documentaries. Until next time.